So welcome, good morning everyone, and welcome to ARCA's learning session on scanning the adaptation field past, present, and emerging needs. This webinar is organized by the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCA, and my name is Julia Kim. I am a senior project manager with the Local Government Commission and also serving as the coordinator for ARCA, and I will be moderating this webinar. Quick overview of today's agenda. I'll run through some logistics, provide a very brief overview of ARCA, as this is our third webinar of the month. Then on to our featured presentation. We'll also have a Q&A session, just so you all have the chance to ask your questions and for our speakers to answer those, and then super quick closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up. So in terms of logistics, everyone is muted except for our panelists, but we do encourage you to connect your audio either through your computer if you do have that capability, or by calling in. You can see the audio options through the Zoom platform in the toolbar, because during the Q&A portion, you will be able to use the hand raising feature to ask a question verbally. You can also submit questions at any point throughout this webinar through the Q&A panel or the Q&A portal. Feel free to also chat us, and we'll make sure that we read those questions aloud during the Q&A. This webinar is also being recorded, so the recording will be made available on our website along with the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll also share that after this webinar through email. All right, so super quick for those who are not familiar with ARCA, we're a statewide network of regional collaboratives working to advance adaptation at the state level as well as regionally and locally. We do a lot of that through knowledge exchange. We also support emerging collaboratives. Currently, we're focused on exploring the potential of launching a collaborative in the inland Southern California region for Riverside and San Bernardino counties, and also engaging with stakeholders in the San Joaquin Valley. We also serve as a channel to state agencies through our state liaison, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, just to ensure that local and regional needs and considerations are reflected in state guidelines and planning documents. And this is our network currently. So you can see we have 7 regional collaboratives spanning 7 different regions throughout California. Again, LGC serves as coordinator and OPR as a state liaison. We also have a number of affiliate members. If you're interested in learning more about ARCA or joining our network, feel free to reach out to me. All right, and now onto the topic at hand. First, I'd like to introduce our presenters. First, we'll hear from Suzanne. So Suzanne Seemoser is a geographer who works nationally and internationally as an independent scholar and consultant from a base in Western Massachusetts. Her work with government agencies, nonprofits, foundations, and other researchers and consultants focuses on adaptation to climate change, resilience, transformation, science policy interactions, and effective climate change communication. She is a prolific writer and inspiring speaker and has served on scientific advisory boards for Future Earth, the International Science Council, formerly the International Social Science Council, the International Human Dimensions Program, the U.S. National Research Council, and numerous other organizations. Thank you so much, Susie, for being here. And we also have Kristen joining us. Kristen Goodrich has served as the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at NOAA's Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve since 2009. That is a mouthful. Her work focuses on equipping decision makers with science-based information and tools for climate change adaptation in Southern and Baja California through training and technical assistance. She is currently completing her PhD at the University of California, Irvine in the School of Social Ecology, where her research explores the complex relationships between people and their environments and the unique role that psychosocial resilience plays in adaptive management, particularly in the U.S.-Mexico border region. Thank you both so much for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Susie.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's wonderful to be here and be with all of you. We have over 80 participants. This is fantastic. So thank you all for making the time. Let me give you a brief overview as soon as I can figure out how to advance the slides, what we're going to do. So I'm going to introduce you in a moment to a study that I've done a couple of years ago on the adaptation field across the U.S. and We want to use you all, if you will, engage you all in updating the state of the field as we then understood it, and see what that brings forward as to the demands and pressures and needs that adaptation professionals like yourselves now have. We're going to do, Chris and I will do this tag team where we do audience engagement alongside with the presentation, so it's not too boring. So even before the Q&A, you will be engaged all along the way. So it'll be fun, I hope. And then we're going to introduce you to a project that Chris and I are doing together with a whole bunch of other colleagues called the Adaptive Mind Project, which is responding to at least one of those needs that adaptation professionals now have. So with that, let me just jump right in. This is the state of the U.S. adaptation field study that Joyce Coffey and Alika Seville and I did a couple of years ago. It's called Rising to the Challenge Together, with my very strong emphasis on the comma together to really make the point that we're going to meet this challenge really if and only we do that together. And this study came together with funding from the Kresge Foundation. It has a shorter executive summary that you can find at this particular link, and also something that we didn't print out but that is available online, appendices, which are really, really important. I really want to emphasize that, because if you're interested in how you can help foster the building of the field or advance it, we have basically suggestions for every single group of people that we can think of, whether it's people in the media, whether it's people who work for boundary organization, whether it's people in the research community or in local government or state government or wherever they might sit. So this is, I think, a really valuable resource. I want to tell you what we did in this particular field assessment in a moment, but just to set the stage for it, we were asked by the Kresge Foundation to do this, to look both backwards and forward. At the time, it was just the end of 2016. They had asked for just an evaluation of their own portfolio. What did they achieve with all the investment that the Kresge Foundation is doing? And then Trump was elected, and all of a sudden the question was, well, given the changed sort of circumstances now, what do we need going forward? And so we did that backward and forward look to try to understand, where is the U.S. adaptation field, and what can we learn from that? What does it need to go forward? One of the things we did as part of that is we asked survey questions, and we did a lot of interviews, almost 90 interviews across the U.S. with leaders across all sectors to try to understand it. And when we asked them, is there such a thing as an adaptation field? Should there be a field? We got a really big range of responses. And maybe the dominant one, that there is an adaptation field emerging and that it is maturing. But as you can see from the range of responses that are listed on this spectrum, people ranged from there should never be a separate field and it's a really bad idea to there is one, but it's stale and stuck and it's not moving anywhere, and every flavor of opinion in between. So it was an interesting exercise just for that, to kind of see where people are. Well, let me say a word about what a field is and why we thought it's an interesting concept to work with. I actually get to a definition in a moment, but we thought about, why would it be important to have that? And I think the best way for me to imagine or explain that is, imagine it is the early 1900s and there is no such thing as a public health field. You have epidemics happening, flu epidemics, and there is no Department of Health you can call on to say, what are we going to do? And that's kind of the situation that, a few years ago we were in with adaptation. We're no longer in that particular place, but it's essentially, a situation where you have all the necessary expertise and skilled workforce to address the issues that come with climate change. You have an idea of what is good practice, what is best practice, or at least better practice. And it's actually established as this is what people do. It's not like everybody has to reinvent the wheel. We have clear goals and values that guide why we're doing what we're doing. There's a network of people we can draw on with adequate training that got them to their positions. There's actually political and public support, imagine that. And that we actually have a way of solving the problems that emerge effectively, efficiently, and in a sort of integrated manner, so that, you know, what the left hand knows what the right hand does. And as a result of that, we actually reduce the societal burden of climate change and the risks that come with it. And we actually maximize opportunities. That's why we think it would be a really great thing to have. Now, what's the goal of that? Well, we're using for this vision of a strong adaptation field in the way I just described, to have really one central goal, and that is to close what we call the resilience gap. Actually, this is based on a publication from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who basically said you need to work on climate change on the front end, reducing emission, making sure it doesn't get any worse, and on the back end, preparing for the unavoidable impacts and managing those impacts, and doing that on a bedrock of social cohesion and equity. So it's absolutely central that both of those are done, you know, at the same time on that social equity bedrock. It won't be coming as a surprise to you, but that is sort of, you know, the way that Union of Concerned Scientists, but also the Kresge Foundation thinks about that. Now, what is a field? What is it made up of? Well, there are a ton of definitions out there, and they all touch on different aspects of it. And we felt, you know, each of the definitions that is out there is actually super helpful, but incomplete. And so we put it together in what we call the 4P field building framework. The 4 Ps are that there is a common purpose. Why are we doing this? What are we working toward? What's the vision we're working on? There are a whole bunch of people that share, you know, a community. There are leaders, there's a network, there's a sense of community that we're in this together and doing this together, and we have all the right people in the field to address these issues. We have a whole bunch of practices that actually help us do it, and they're known. And, you know, you see here the range. We have practices for, you know, coming up with innovations. We have shared ideas, a common body of knowledge and tools that we draw on, not, you know, 60,000 tools that nobody knows about, but something that we clearly know this is how to do that. We do that with shared goals, values, and actions coming together. We know how to collaborate effectively, and we basically have mechanisms to build skills and capacities and communicate across all these different, as a cross-cutting practice, if you will. And all of that is supported by what we call the pillars of support, both policy support and financial support. If you have those 4 things, those, you know, 4 Ps, you are actually shaping and building and sustaining a field. And so what we did in our report is to actually say, now let's look at what's the state of the purpose, the people, the practice, and the pillars of support across the US. Well, let me walk you very quickly through what we found. And then I'm going to ask you, and Kristen is going to walk you through an effort to actually see how you feel that has advanced in the last 2 years. But in 2017, what we found is that the people we talked to all had a different definition of what the problem is, and they were mostly reacting to emerging things rather than being forward looking. There wasn't a very much of a unifying vision. What are we working toward? People, you know, had very narrow ideas of the, you know, we just want to get back to normal, or we just want to fix this one piece of infrastructure. So everyone had a piece of it, but there was no shared vision or common vision that brought us together. There was certainly no agreement on the importance of social equity and cohesion within adaptation. For some, it was absolutely central. For some, it was, yeah, we should do this. And for some, they didn't even mention it. There was no agreement on priorities, neither regional nor sectoral, nor, you know, how to build a field. And what was most surprising, actually, was a pretty widespread lack of urgency. You know, this sort of like, okay, I'm just dealing with my project, but no sense of the magnitude of what's coming. So that was what we found at that time. In terms of the pillars of support, so, you know, think about the end of the Obama administration moving into the Trump administration. There was a lot of funding that was made available around crises. Think about Sandy or some other major events and the follow-ons like Resilient by Design or something like that. But, you know, no matter who we talked to, no one said there was enough money out there. there was certainly a pervasive lack of institutionalized, coordinated, and sustained funding, right? Everybody was complaining about, yeah, the funding comes and goes, but the problems stay. There was just nothing really sustained out there that people could draw on and count on. The federal assets were very much feared to be diminishing with the Trump administration coming in. There was a sense that the federal agencies had played a very significant role at some point, and their support was, at least being threatened at that time. And then in terms of the signal of, how seriously one should take this from both policymakers or the public, there was not a very strong signal that more should be done. And so, what people really agreed with at the time was that because we don't have these pillars of policy and funding, that really is a drag on the field. We're not moving forward rapidly enough because of those things. In terms of the P related to people, that was actually one of the areas that we felt was probably the most hopeful or optimistic sort of situation. We had seen a strong growth in numbers, and the people we talked to felt that, but some people felt there were some key gaps in terms of who is involved. And I just want to point here to, this is a data that Julia shared with me in the last few days about who came to the California Adaptation Forum, the last one in 2018. And you see the sort of range of folks, about 40+% are out of the government arena, about 25% or so, not quite, out of the not-for-profit, traditionally one of the major areas, and still only a relatively small number that you would clearly associate with environmental justice, climate justice. The private sector with both consultants and utilities is a growing sector, and that was one of those areas that was clearly growing. Academic folks who for a long time have been sort of dominant in the adaptation arena, at least, in the halls of academia, they are relatively small group here compared to sort of the government sector or the nonprofit sector, but they're still there. The people who connect the science to practice, the boundary organizations, a very small number only, which I personally feel like ought to be much bigger. And then a little bit of representation of the philanthropic sector. So, this in and of itself might give you a sense of, who should be more there, or you might have a feeling about that. What we found is that smaller cities, rural areas, and tribes are still relatively, missing from the larger picture of the adaptation field. Much emphasis on urban areas, major urban areas. And it's difficult, right? You want to build this cohesion, and yet you also want diversity in it. And there is sort of an unavoidable tension in, how much diversity and how useful then a network is. There are some very specific communities of practice, like the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, or some tribal, networks exist too. And that might be the way, to address that you have both the generic field and then some smaller communities of practice within it. The federal leadership is declining, at least at the time, and that was really seen with some worries among most of the people we spoke to. Many recognize that the climate justice movement is a really important influence, but what the concerns are and the approaches and the way of thinking that comes from that movement is not deeply integrated in what the rest of the community is doing. So some positive things there, and not not all of it great yet. In terms of practice, well, at the time, we felt that mostly people are still stuck in planning, or that planning are prepared and, very limited amounts of action actually then happen. And what happens is mostly the small, lower regret stuff. And I put a little picture here of some, green infrastructure sort of decoration, if you will. But some of the larger pieces of work that need to be done, and especially some policy changes that would have a much broader impact, there's not much there yet at the time. When we asked people what they thought was best practice, well, we got every answer under the sun. There isn't a best practice. Nobody knows. There shouldn't be best practice. We all need to figure it out, and so on and so forth. Mostly people just shrugged and said, well, I don't know. And so, there is progress being made, but what we felt and what a lot of the interviewees felt is that there isn't really something going on yet that's commensurate with the accelerating climate change challenge that we're facing. Certainly inadequate communication about adaptation per se. Most people just wanted to focus on mainstreaming. I'll come back to that in a moment. And the acceptance of the need for some bigger, deeper systemic changes, transformative changes, was very limited at the time. So here, I just want to give you that overview. There's sort of a spectrum of possible actions one might take. And early on in the work on adaptation, it was like, okay, there's one impact, let's focus on the one thing, right? So that's the on the left-hand side. Most of the work now is happening in managing climate risks. So that's really, developing information products or tools and building adaptive capacity, more of the investment in the social infrastructure. Very little, and the only place really where we saw the more transformative work that would get at the root causes of why we're vulnerable and trying to change that and trying to build a very different form of economy, the transformative work that is, only really visible in the efforts of the climate justice community. Otherwise, this is not yet seen as where the work ought to be. So we want to now involve you, and Kristen, I'm turning it over here to you. I'll just switch it over to Mentimeter, and maybe you can walk people through it and explain it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Susie. Hi, everyone. Kristen Goodrich here. And we really, I'll echo Susie in just, we really appreciate you spending your hour here with us. What to do was use this opportunity to hear from you. And we want to use this software called Mentimeter. It's a polling or voting software. So here's just a quick slide to help orient you to the software if you haven't used it already. If you can pull out your cell phone or just right on your laptop, pull up your browser. You can type in www.menti.com, and we'll be prompting you with polling slides where you can type the number provided on the polling slide into the Mentimeter code area, and then we'll vote. So this is just an opportunity to reflect a bit on what Susie's just presented, and we'll be using this software throughout. Your vote will be counted instantly. So Susie has a slide up here right now with a question just to get you comfortable with the software. How many years have you worked on adaptation and resilience? The code is 804619. You can see it at the top right of your slide. So the options here are less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or greater than 10 years. At the risk of sounding like a talk show host, again, the code is 804619.
Susie and Kristen, it does look like on the Menti site, we have a question up here that asks about where we've seen the most growth over the past 2 years. But not that question that you have up on the screen.
Let me quickly go in and make sure. Hang on a second. So I'm clicking on the first and then present. So you should see now here we go. People are seeing it. How many years have you worked on adaptation, and people are finding it? All right. We have about over 100 participants on the webinar, so keep it coming. And Kristen, you just let me know when you want to move on.
Thanks, Susie. It looks like my Zoom crashed, I think maybe that we have, so feel free to take it over, and I'll get myself back.
Okay. Well, so we're getting a sense here. About 70 people responded, and you can see that the majority of the people on this call have actually worked on adaptation resilience only for the last 5 years or so. So that's really an interesting perspective that you're going to bring to the state of the field. So let's move to the next one. Just get a sense. This is another practice session. Where do you do most of your adaptation work? Is it within California, outside California, but in the U.S., or outside the U.S.? I know we have some participants from outside. So let's see. That's great. And Kristen, let me know when you're back, so I'll just move it on, but this is great. So we're getting a sense here. Majority is working in California or in the US, but a few of them are outside, actually outside the US as well. So wonderful. Okay, so the next question that we have is how familiar you were with the State of the Field assessment report I just talked about before today. Oh, that's great. So we got something new to tell you. This is fantastic. All right, there's one diehard who read it pretty much cover to cover. Thank you. You dipped in and out of it. Some of you heard about it and some read the executive summary. But most of you were not familiar, so that's great. Are you back, Kristen?
I just was able to get back into Zoom. Yes, thanks.
All right, so you can have it back. That's about the number of folks we're getting is around 70. So go on, feel free to go on.
Okay, thanks, Susie. Right now I'm seeing the State of the Field assessment report question. So you might want to continue polling just at the risk of my,
okay.
my computer not cooperating. Thanks.
Okay, so this question here is about the current state of the U.S. adaptation field and asking for your agreement or disagreement with the field has a clear and strong purpose, so that's that P. The field has all the right people in it. The field is a well-defined, proven practices, and the field rests on strong pillars of support. Let's see what you're thinking. And, you know, this is to the extent you can touch the U.S. adaptation field. If, you know, you're working only outside the U.S. and you want to, you know, say it for your country or wherever you work, that's totally fine too. So whatever part of the field that you have a glimpse on, just feel free to just focus on that. Yeah, so the purpose is emerging as being more strongly developed than practices or people, and the pillars of support the least. All right. All right, that seems like maybe the number of people we're getting, so that's great. And let's see, one more question, I think, is for this one. Over the past 2 years, where have you seen more or less growth in the adaptation field? So where is the strongest growth? Some of you have already entered this before because it was up before. So whoever hasn't answered yet, please feel free to go in and just add where you feel it's become stronger. So we've made more progress on the people and the purpose than on practices and pillars. Very interesting. Well, we're really grateful for you to think about this with us and give us an update on where things are moving forward. I recently did a thing like this at the National Adaptation Forum, and there were quite similar answers to what you said. So this is great confirmation. Thank you all for that. I think we're going to go from here to back to the presentation and then come back to engaging you on other issues later. So thank you for now for that. So interesting, you mentioned just now that, some progress is being made on the practices. There is certainly capacity and skill building going on. We noticed actions really across, all the sectors and the regions of the U.S. Certainly more people in the field. You just mentioned that great progress has been made in that regard. Again, this focuses mostly on mainstreaming and, a few efforts. I wouldn't say it's widespread, but certainly there are some efforts where people try to address adaptation, mitigation, and social justice and cohesion at the same time. What's not yet sufficiently happening is really the integration across sectors, geographies, scales of governance. That's still really a problematic area. And often segments of society. So the climate justice, environmental justice community works almost by itself, if you will, not deeply integrated with what is happening in the rest of the adaptation field. There isn't very fast social learning. We're not sharing widely what is happening, what we're learning in California, and sharing that with the East Coast and vice versa. And certainly some of these things could be shared. There is not yet an effort at widespread education or standard setting or professional certification. There are emerging efforts, but it's not certainly at the level and at the scope and speed that we need. And that's, that was to us some of the biggest challenge that we felt the field faces, that, we're all pedaling in our own little backyard, doing our own little projects, but really, are we thinking big enough and thinking fast enough for what is needed, and really embrace in certain areas that we need to do transformative work, not just, tweaking of where we are or just elevating a house or two or moving a house or two or something like that. At the same time, the speed of climate change is accelerating. The political environment, you all know, is in a stalemate. It's very difficult to get people from across the aisle to work with each other. The leadership at the federal level is, gone into hiding. Not that there is not anything working, but it basically has to be done in the dark of night and under different terms than climate change and adaptation. The funding isn't nearly big enough for the kind of things we're facing. And what's interesting to me too is that we had this legacy of really thinking about it and framing the whole adaptation challenge as it's got to start with the science. It's got to be informed by science, and it's not like we don't need that, but it tends to make everybody focus on let's get the science right before we can do anything else, or in the face of uncertainty we can't do anything, and we're framing it sort of very narrowly at one problem at a time as opposed to seeing the bigger integrated picture. And so, that if you take all of these challenges together and where we are and what's coming, and then we already have a workforce challenge and culture of overwork in us, that really poses some enormous challenges on the people like yourselves who need to keep going. So it's, on the one hand, it's the climate change challenge, but it's also all the rest of what makes it so difficult to move forward on any of those things. And then this happens, right? Then we have these unbelievable disasters happening. In this case, Paradise wiping out an entire town, lots of other places, flooding all over the world, all over this country. Here are just slides from the most recent past with the flooding across the Midwest. And, just now we're just past several days of unbelievable heat, humid heat here on the East Coast. And on it goes like this, right? It's just, you just open the news every morning and you find yet another set of disasters out there. Or you find news of reports like this, the IPCC's 1.5 report, which basically said, that we would need rapid and far-reaching transitions in all the sectors, essentially, to still make it, to contain the warming to 1.5 or even just 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. And it's not like we haven't done anything like that fast before, but we've never done anything at the scale that we need to get there, given that this is a global problem. And what's important to me here is another of the key findings: increasing investment in physical and social infrastructure as a key enabling condition to enhance resilience and adaptive capacities is absolutely important to do. The social infrastructure, what is meant by that is you. It's the people like you and me who are doing this work. Investment in the people who do it and in the readiness of society. And you have, something like the National Climate Assessment, the fourth one that came out at the end of last year. Again, it tells the story of we got to do a lot more. It's not commensurate with the scale of what's coming, or else we face growing losses. So all of this means there is this persistent and pressing and emerging need to do a lot more on climate and uncertainty literacy, meaning there are still lots of people who don't know how to make decisions in the face of uncertainty or what to do. What does it mean to really think big? It's still difficult to talk about it and engage effectively, meaningfully, the communities that need be at the table. There's very limited cultural competence still in how to do that. And I think it really goes beyond cultural competence. It is really a shift in thinking that is required, of dealing both with these historical legacies of distrust and difficult interactions, and changing that as we go and healing some of these old wounds and moving forward. And then, of course, there's this vast area of climate adaptation finance that we need to get a better handle on and remove obstacles on all fronts to bring the sufficient resources to it. Certainly, there's guidelines, codes, standards, best practices that we continue to need. And I believe, and this is part of the motivation for Kristen and my work in this area, we need people to have the psychological skills to both cope with and deal with what's coming. And what I mean by that is not just dealing with, climate change personally, but we're dealing with communities who are in despair, who are in grief, who are, asked to do very big changes. And they're not particularly happy and welcoming necessarily. So it is the skills to deal with our own reactions to climate change as much as to deal with the challenges that come. Here is just a very quick picture of a photo project that was done at the National Adaptation Forum. Maybe some of you have seen this. I don't know if Kelly particularly is on this call, but this was a photo project where the person asked, what concerns you about this? And people wrote, how can we know this and do nothing? This is adaptation professionals and their responses to what is happening. Will you forgive us, the future generations, right? Or how do we help each other grieve so we can move forward with revolutionary action? Not getting stuck in mourning, but actually freeing up our energies, our emotional energies to move forward. And that is very much what motivates Kristen and me and others on this project. So Kristen, do you want to try again with this one and see if it...
Yes, thanks, Susie. I'll give it a whirl. It seems that Zoom is cooperating again with me. So
great. All right. I'm moving.
Great. Well, thank you for that. We're back to menti.com, same code, 804619. You can pick up your cell phone or go back to your browser to help us better understand, from your perspective, what has been the most influential in shaping the adaptation field over the past 2 years.
You just write in your answers here.
We're seeing some responses coming in. Natural disasters, as Susie has been talking to, disaster response, increasing storm events. We're also seeing folks talk about science, climate research, extreme weather. We love when these word clouds come together because it really gives us a great snapshot at the kinds of ideas that you all are thinking about when trying to change and shape the adaptation field. We're seeing flooding, fires, so a lot here related to natural disasters prompting the adaptation field and the development of it. You can see wildfire and disasters here at the core. Thank you all. This is really great. Susie, maybe the next question. So we also like to know from you, what is this experience like for you? If you agree or disagree or feel somewhere in between, that you're seeing the effects of climate change already, that you worry a lot about climate change, or that you rarely talk to others about how you feel about climate change. We're seeing folks tend to strongly agree with that idea of seeing effects of climate change already and worrying a lot about climate change. Some disagreement with rarely talking to others about how you feel about climate change, which, you know, may be a unique experience among this group, as we're finding in some of our research. So it looks like a number of votes have come in, but that in general, among this group, you're seeing the effects of climate change. You're also worrying a lot about climate change, but in some cases, you may be talking to others about how you feel about climate change. So our next question is, before this presentation, how much have you thought about the added stress of climate change on professionals like yourself? From I have never really thought about it before to I think about it all the time. We have some options here that range the scale of very infrequently to all the time. You see, so a number of responses right now, close to 20 individuals thinking about it all the time, and fewer not ever really thinking about it before. And then it looks like a cluster here too, about a number of individuals thinking about it occasionally to a lot. Not unexpected with this group and the type of work that you all encounter on a daily basis. Great. Thank you all for participating. It really helps us to understand you better as a group, but also visualize a bit more about what you're thinking about and how you're responding to what we've also just presented.
Great. So let's go back then and talk a little bit about this project that Kristen and I are working on, that is really a response to this challenge that many of you also share, which is that we have added stresses. How do we deal with that? What is it that allows us to keep going in the face of these growing stresses? So here's the vision. This is, if we ever get this project funded, and you'll hear about that in a moment, this is the vision that we have, that climate adaptation professionals like yourselves, resilience planners, community planners, working in this field everywhere, working on the front lines of climate change, have the skills, capacities, peer and institutional support to effectively and compassionately face these challenges that come with a rapidly, continually, and sometimes traumatically or profoundly changing world. That's what we want to achieve. It's no small thing. But this is the challenge that we face, right? You are working in a field where you have things, you come into the office and there is constant, rapid change, great uncertainty, surprises, and you need to be flexibly responding to that. Some days you come into the office or you don't go in the office because you have just had a disaster happen in your own home or in your own town, in your community and region. And increasingly, you're being asked to deal with transformative change, whether that's retreat from the coast or changing a particular sector in agriculture or, you name it, right? Dealing with the complete rebuilding of a town like in Paradise. How do you do that? That's the psychological aspect of your job description that was never written into your job description. So It's a concern that is increasingly recognized. You see more and more articles now in the newspapers about climate grief and anxiety. Mostly, though, it's focused on recognizing this for the population as a whole, the mental health impacts of things that happen to people exposed to these kinds of challenges. It's certainly an acceptance of the grief and anxiety that's coming out, but there is very little research to date on what the occupational risk is for people working in this field. To the extent that it's there, it's for outdoor workers or first responders. It's not yet there for the people like yourselves who work on adaptation and face these issues in your work as well. There is a little bit of that recognizes that particular climate scientists or people who are deeply in the know have to do a lot of emotional labor to basically deal with that. Here, keeping the heart a long way from the brain, this is sort of how scientists are trained to deal with it. And many of you work in fields where, it's a technical problem. You need to just deal with the technical side and be objective and be neutral. And yet you have probably, if you take the time to really think about what do these numbers mean that the science bring forward, you actually have probably a whole bunch of emotional reactions. What do you do with that? We've not been trained for it. The adaptation field is not a trauma-informed field. It is not a field that has made mental health and psychological resilience central to its mission, at least not yet. And at this point, I want to turn it back to Kristen, who has been actually doing some really amazing survey work to show you some of our initial results.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, this idea that Susie presents that no one in our field has been trained to deal with this was a pretty significant motivator for me to be thinking about some of these issues in relation to how the adaptation professionals and environmental professionals and the communities that they serve are coping with some of these issues, and if there is any resources that we can develop to help these individuals cope, especially in the context of natural disasters and of course the more chronic changing climate. So what we did was we set out to better characterize among adaptation professionals their experiences as kind of a first step in advancing the work of the Adaptive Mind Project. So right now we're in the process of analyzing this data, and although it is still preliminary, we think it's really powerful. One of the questions we asked among adaptation professionals, and I should say some of our respondents are representative of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, NOAA's Sea Grant Extension Program, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network I mentioned, but then also a unique audience we felt through NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve System, which represents very different types of roles within the adaptation field: research, education, stewardship, coastal training, and management, those who are dealing more with the management of programs, but also land management. So that's just a quick snapshot of the types of audiences we've surveyed thus far. And I will say too, we are planning to expand our survey to include other groups of adaptation professionals. But what we have right now is a pretty strong indication that the individuals that we have surveyed are experiencing pretty significant burnout in their work. So you can see here, 80% of our respondents reported experiencing burnout in their work. And we know that there is a crisis in the United States among the American workforce. There was a recent Gallup poll just in 2019 with over 7,500 respondents that reported 44% of which reported feeling burned out sometimes, 23% feeling burned out very often or always. So we know among our workforce, they're experiencing significant burnout, and we want to better understand how the unique experiences of working in the climate adaptation field is layering upon that burnout crisis that already is at play. Next slide.
So we gotta move on quickly. So, just to give you a time check.
Sure. Thanks. So we also, in addition to doing quantitative data, have been collecting qualitative data. This again is just a snapshot of some very, very powerful quotes that we're getting from our qualitative data that our professionals are feeling they're not doing enough or fast enough, that there are racialized stresses as a white person working primarily with people of color, and they're feeling that they're just learning to navigate their role in the most humble way possible. And of course, many of you may be able to relate, they're dealing with the barriers of bureaucracy. Next slide, Susie. In our study, we tried to better quantify what types of work adaptation professionals are engaging in. We see a pretty large percentage of adaptation professionals engaging in communications and outreach, and really want to understand how that unique role plays into the stresses of your daily work. Next slide. And then another kind of powerful snapshot of the data that we've been collecting. You can see here when we ask individuals about how they're feeling, in asking particularly about emotional exhaustion from the topics they address in their work, the feelings around that their work is not enough to address climate change. You can see here individuals, adaptation professionals that are our survey respondents, are reporting that they are experiencing these feelings of that their work is not doing enough to address climate change. Reports of a few times a year, you can see in this dark green every day. But we're hopeful because we also ask questions about how individuals are feeling in terms of determination to succeed in their work. So while we're seeing emotional exhaustion and feelings that their work is not enough, there is also reports of determination to succeed in their work. So there is a hopeful message here. So we're back to our Mentimeter. We want to just quickly again ask you a couple questions about what you just heard. Susie's changing to the next slide here. So another word cloud, if you would be so kind to offer some thoughts about, again, what you just heard, regardless of whether you've thought about this a lot or not. What issues and challenges does this raise for you now as you reflect upon it? One individual reporting on individual sustainability. I really like that term. See, relief, grief, pain, PTSD, balance, feelings of hopelessness, the idea that we've been trying to get across that the discussion of these issues, I see someone here put discussion of anxiety, is really critical to moving forward. And we believe that talking about it as well may help to improve the kind of organizational and institutionalized ways that our own organizations may treat these issues, and how we may be able to provide support and training to advance our work in this field. Next slide, Susie.
Yeah. They're still coming in here, but this is, we're seeing clearly the stress, frustration, grief, need for personal resilience, anxiety. So this is really great to see. And all I can say is you're not alone. We've done this now a number of times, and this is things we keep hearing.
So our next question is, what are the psychosocial needs of professionals in your field that you've heard about? Yes, work-life balance, separation for your job. That's something we have been seeing a lot at least in our survey responses, both in creating some distance from your job, but also a concerning report of folks thinking about potentially leaving their job because of the stresses of it. Certainly something we don't want to see and want to prevent. Hope. Always a really strong central theme when we do ask groups this question. Self-care, collaboration, communication, support, and community. Hope remains a really strong and central theme of this question. Thank you so much all for providing your words and thoughts.
Yeah, that's really great. So, I'm not going to speak about it. It's almost the end of the thing. I'm going to just move us very quickly to the last slide so that you can, basically, we can get to the discussion. One quick thing here that I will mention is that, you know, we haven't received funding for this project yet. Right now, this is basically a labor of love, and because it's apparently not quite yet fit in with anybody else's funding. And so what we have developed is put a handout together of resources, which we'd be happy to share in case you're interested in getting some if you are interested. I'm also really interested in any funding ideas you might have, but I want to open it up just the last few minutes that we have to any questions or concerns. And I don't know, Julia, do you want to manage that? I know there've been a lot of comments coming in.
Yeah, I can absolutely do that. Thank you both so much. So I know we don't have a ton of time, but folks, feel free to send your questions in or use the hand raising feature. So we do have a question from Jess. In your experience, what indicates that leaders who can shift our thinking will emerge to take adaptation to scale?
Can you repeat the question? What characterizes the leader? Is that what the question was?
Right. So what's the indication that leaders who can shift our thinking will emerge to then advance and accelerate adaptation?
I don't know. I think some very famous people have had some comments about, you know, when the necessity arises, the leaders emerge. That's the simple answer. I think the difficult or the more complicated answer for me anyway is that a leader at this time would actually be a truth teller, would be a very courageous person who would not beat about the bush about the challenges that we're facing, and would help frame the transformation and the challenges and the bigness of what we need to do before us. So in some ways, it's an appeal to our greatness that doesn't sound like, you know, make America great again. It sounds and just really pushes everyone down to the ground in the process. It would ask us to dig into our deepest resources as individuals and as communities and as a nation to think beyond our individual needs and greed, if you will, and to work against and really against our traditional ways of handling things, which are very small, very narrow, bounded within very small silos. I think the answers now need to be much bigger, and a leader in this time, a true leader, would name it in that way.
Yeah, and I would just add too, Susie, I think something we're learning from our survey in particular, and what we're asking of individuals, is to tell us a bit about, you know, some of the traits that they feel make them successful in their work. And I think if we can better identify some of those traits, maybe some of them are linked to leadership. I believe most all of them are, that we can help cultivate some of that within individuals and then across organizations by creating more diverse workforces. So, you know, just as an example, some of the traits are empathy and humility and being flexible, open-minded, but in particularly the strong value-driven idea about caring for the environment, which brings so much of us to our work and helps us wake up every day and kind of face these difficult truths. I think if our work in this project can help better cultivate some of that within an individual and within the leaders in this field, we can make some great headway.
Great.
I think we have time for one more, maybe two if we can squeeze it in. Do you think climate adaptation is more or less popular with the American public compared to kind of climate change more broadly?
Well, I can, you know, simply say I don't know if it's a popularity contest. I think that climate change as a topic is highly politicized and comes with a ton of baggage. But, you know, if you drive outside and you drive through salt water, if you're, you know, having to breathe smoke, then it's very clear to you what your priorities are, right? People have to deal with the issues that are right in front of them. It's unfortunately very late because, you know, when you feel it that way, it becomes a reactive thing. And under duress and under time pressure like that, we don't necessarily make the best decisions, but at least it is something that people get as to the necessity of it. For a long time, there was a sort of an issue around, whether talking about adaptation is counter the efforts to mitigate. And most people have found that that's actually not true. When you see how difficult adaptation is, adaptation looks like a basement bargain deal. So, it becomes something that people might find difficult and hard to embrace, but they also see the necessity. So I think from that point of view, it's much more tangible maybe than doing something for climate change when, you don't know how your little efforts to reduce emissions add up to something global. So it's a difficult thing, but I think people are getting that we need to do both. In fact, many adaptation people involved in adaptation will tell you that if we do not continue to mitigate, there is no tomorrow, we might not have a tomorrow, right? So, the necessity to really make actually adaptation feasible and possible requires that we continue to do mitigation. So it's not an either or, it's complementary, and both are needed urgently.
Kristen, any final quick thoughts before we wrap up?
I was just tracking the chat, and I think we would love to respond, probably because we're running out of time. We can respond to them maybe in a written way, but there's lots of great resources that folks have brought up and ideas for collaboration. And just to say, we're in touch with some of these folks already and thinking about collaboration and our unique niche in this growing field, and just appreciate all of the thoughts during our talk, and very much appreciate all of the participation through Mentimeter. It really, as Susie said, you're not alone. We see a lot of data coming through in these unique ways, and just look forward to continuing this conversation and hopefully bringing adaptation professionals the resources they need to continue to cope in the face of climate change. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. Susie, any quick final thoughts before we conclude?
No, this is great. I appreciate the comments, and let's see if we can post them along with a PowerPoint with some responses, to the ones that ask questions. So thank you all for that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I do want to be mindful of time. I know we're just a minute or two over, so wanted to thank everyone who joined us. Definitely special thanks to Susie and Kristen. This would not be possible without either of you. So we will be sharing the webinar recording along with the PowerPoint presentation. There have been requests for the results from the Mentimeter polls to be shared. So Susie and Kristen, I'll touch base with you on that. And there have been a ton of great resources being shared through the chat. So we'll be sure to compile all of that. And then if you have any additional questions, please do go ahead and send that our way. Feel free to send that to me directly, and we can try to compile written responses and share that out as part of follow-up. And with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all so very much, and we hope you'll tune in to our next learning session.
Great.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Susie. Thanks, Kristen.